US annual consumer prices rise at the fastest rate in over 4 decades. Figures in June increased by 9.1%, casting dimmer prospects for the already soaring cost of living in America. With the Fed looking set to hike interest rates again this month, world markets react. The euro falls below $1 for the first time since December 2002. Ukraine severs relations with North Korea over the regime's recognition of 2 pro-Russian breakaway areas in Ukraine's east as independent regions. Kyiv says the confirmation by Pyongyang's embassy in Moscow undermines the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Torrential rain across South Korea hits the capital area with over 150 milliliters of rain, causing partial flooding of train and subway links and damage to infrastructure.
Good morning. Welcome to New Day at Arirang. Inflation across the world is showing no sign of slowing down. The U.S. Consumer Price Index, which is a broad measure of everyday goods and services related to the cost of living, has soared 9.1% from a year ago.
This is the biggest in 40 years. Worrying news for U.S. households amid the skyrocketing cost of living and worries over another Fed interest rate hike. Kim Yo-sun has our top story.
The U.S. Consumer Price Index has jumped a whopping 9.1% from a year ago in June, leading to shoppers paying sharply higher prices for a variety of goods. According to data released Wednesday by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this marked the largest 12-month increase since November 1981. The CPI, which measures changes in prices of goods and services from a consumer's perspective, came in much higher than the market estimate of 8.8%. On a monthly basis, the index rose 1.3% in June from the previous month. While the price of gasoline was one of the largest contributors to the surge, experts point out how this had a fast spillover effect across many other sectors.
I think what's surprising is, like I said, just how dramatically those elevated gas prices and energy prices have flowed throughout the economy, particularly when we go look at food is another sector.
The core CPI, excluding volatile food and energy, increased 0.7% in June from the previous month, again above the market expectation of a 0.6% gain. Pundits say such inflation levels could push the U.S. central bank into an even more aggressive position. Against this backdrop, the euro dropped below the U.S. dollar for the first time in nearly 2 decades. A weakening currency will make imports more expensive for Eurozone countries, especially goods priced in dollars, such as crude oil. This ultimately could contribute to even higher inflation in the Eurozone, which is already running at 8.6% for June. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
South Korea's central bank raised interest rates by 50 basis points. It's the highest single hike by the Bank of Korea and the first time rates were raised 3 times in a row. Ji-young zooms in on the efforts to bring down inflation, running at a near 24-year high.
South Korea's central bank has raised its benchmark interest rate by 0.5 percentage point for the first time in history. The decision was made following a monetary policy meeting on Wednesday to raise its key interest rate to 2.25%.
The Monetary Policy Board has unanimously decided to raise the key rate by 50 basis points, as there is the greater need for preemptive measures to stabilize consumer prices.
The 50 basis point increase, the so-called big step, is the largest single increase by the Bank of Korea since it implemented interest rates as its primary policy tool in 1999. This also is the first time ever that the bank has adjusted the rate upward 3 times in 3 straight meetings. The central bank's main drive for the unprecedented hike is to rein in inflation, running at a near 24-year high, and the bank said it's going to stay above 6% for a while. One expert says the rate hike is expected to help stabilize consumer prices.
The public's expectation of inflation is growing fast, so the Bank of Korea is signaling the stabilization of prices by raising rates, which can help suppress the rise in consumer prices and wages.
She said the rate hike could also help prevent a further weakening of the Korean won. The won has tumbled more than 9% against the US dollar this year, taking the exchange rate to a 13-year high. The rate increase also followed U.S. Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hike of 0.75 percentage point last month, the sharpest one-time rate hike in nearly 30 years. Amid concerns that interest rates in the U.S. could soon surpass those of South Korea, the bank said it is likely to maintain its tightened monetary policies.
It is desirable to gradually raise interest rates by 25 basis points for a while.
However, the expert says there could be side effects from the big step.
Household and corporate debt have been accumulating since before the COVID-19 pandemic economic crisis. With mounting debt, private spending could go down. Also, it could lead to further polarization of society, as those in low-income groups are likely to be hit harder.
The Bank of Korea said it'll look for ways to support socially vulnerable groups who are likely to go through greater difficulties due to the rate hike. It'll also maintain a 0.25% interest rate for loans to businesses who have suffered losses because of COVID-19. 엄지영, 아리랑 뉴스.
It's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. Just like we saw yesterday, in a move called a big step, South Korea's central bank delivered a half percentage point rate hike for the first time in history, raising its key interest rate to 2.25%.
Now, this is also the first time ever that the Bank of Korea has adjusted the rate upwards 3 times in a row. So what does this all mean for us here in South Korea? And will this move be successful in taming the current inflation? For more on this, we have our Professor Song Soo-young with us at Chungang University in Seoul. A very good morning to you, Professor Song.
Yeah, good morning to you.
Well. Right, so what does this big step really signify for us here in South Korea?
I just mentioned that this is one of the biggest step in Korean Bank of Korea's interest rate hike. So what does this mean is the purpose of the interest rate hike is clear, that the Bank of Korea would like to deliver the clear message to the market, in the particularly the financial market, that the Bank of Korea is ready to protect and preempt the exchange rate depreciation, and also as well as the potential effect of the wage and the price spiral, or the demand side driven the inflation rate hike would be deterred by the Bank of Korea's step to raise the interest rate, and they are ready to raise the interest rate also.
That's right. Like you said, there are certain aspects to the move that there's many reasons behind this, but for everyday consumers, the most important thing is inflation, right? And you've mentioned inflation briefly, but the chief of Bank of Korea also said he will continue raising the rates. Will this actually tame the inflation? Is probably one of the biggest questions that everyday consumers are asking right now.
Clearly, as long as the Bank of Korea would like to take the risk of the economic growth, so risk the reducing the economic growth, and maybe even risk suffering from some recession, then it is clear that inflation rate will be caught, and there is no such a big inflation rate hike, such as in the United States, as I mentioned earlier, that the 9.1% interest rate, inflation rate for June. So that is very huge. But in Korea, it is relatively a little bit moderate. It's 6 point some percentage point of inflation, CPI inflation. So to that regard, we are not as risky as the U.S. Economy, and also the employment rate in Korea is also currently very good, 62 point something percentage point. So unemployment rate relatively low, but clearly the biggest burden is household debt has been sold so much for the past several years. But the reason is we have to be careful interpreting, because household debt is borne by the not because the government aims to remain as the fiscal policy as robust as possible. So which means that the government debt has not risen as much as the other countries in the wake of the pandemic crisis. So that is all the burden would be borne by the shoulders of some household. That is a really serious threat.
Big risk. And Professor, so we saw in Europe that the euro depreciated to a level below the dollar for the first time since 2002. And well, there have been worries about a capital exodus here in South Korea as well. So what does this trend of currency depreciation really have for South Korea?
Actually, when I look around, well, according to the data set, actually the Australia, some days ago, the Bank of Canada has increased the interest rate very much. And most of the countries who are concerned about the depreciation of their own currency, then they begin to raise the interest rate. And the exchange rate, despite some strong dollars, because the dollar index has increased a lot, and even the euro and euro is equal to almost $1, so that is called euro parity, and has remained. So this means that I think the background of why this occurs is because of the collapse and burst of some such as crypto coins investment. And then all the funds has been flown into crypto coin investment, has been flown back to the safe and the stable currency such as US dollar. That is some behind the force to make the dollar stronger than ever. So all these are driven by not because of the demand pool, but rather it is because of the supply side effect has prevailed. So the Bank of Korea do not have much to do with supply side, because interest rate hike does not produce more products, or they cannot resolve some supply disruption at all. So
well, it looks like it's beyond the Bank of Korea's control, and
right.
I'm afraid we are out of time, Professor, so this is where we'll leave the interview today. But thank you so much, Professor Song Soo-young at Chungang University of Seoul.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, torrential rain in the Greater Seoul area on Wednesday has left one dead and resulted in a series of infrastructure damage and disruption.
That's right, and a male worker in his 50s was killed by a train while inspecting tracks near Jungnang Station. At Kumcheongu Office Station, tracks became submerged, halting subway operations on Seoul Metro's line number 1 during rush hour. Meanwhile, Gwangmyeong KTX Express station just outside of Seoul was inundated after a nearby construction site flooded, restricting access for passengers. Normal rail service has already resumed. Parts of major roads and highways were also closed off but are now all normalized. And while conditions are improving in Seoul, those living in southwestern Jeollanam-do province will still need to brace for more heavy rain. As part of his first trip to the Middle East, U.S. President Joe Biden landed in Israel on Wednesday, where he pledged to expand Israel's relationship with Washington and other Arab countries during remarks upon arrival. In line with his efforts to bring Israel and Saudi Arabia closer, Biden will embrace the Trump-era Abraham Accords that normalize relations between the two nations. This would mark a rare move for Biden, who has focused on reversing many of his predecessors' policies following his stay in Israel. Biden will head to Saudi Arabia, aiming to reset bilateral ties that had been strained over humanitarian issues. There, he will also meet with the leaders of the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries to discuss increasing global oil supply and Iran's nuclear activities. And that wraps up the first half of New Day at Arirang, but stick around. Coming up in the second half,
we cover US President Joe Biden's first trip to the Middle East, where he will make stops at Israel and Saudi Arabia and meet with 11 Middle Eastern leaders. We'll discuss the significance of this trip in the second half of New Day at Arirang, so don't go anywhere. Stay tuned to Arirang.
South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduced a Korean New Day. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
Feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
Welcome back to the second half of New Day at Arirang. Ukraine has severed relations with North Korea over the regime's recognition of 2 pro-Russian separatist regions in eastern Ukraine.
The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry said in a statement Wednesday that the move comes as it sees Pyongyang's decision as undermining the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Earlier in the day, North Korea's embassy in Seoul recognized the independence of Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, according to Russia's TASS agency. The North's move to recognize the breakaway regions makes it only the 3rd country in the world to do so, following Russia and Syria. New photos show 2 North Koreans being sent back to the regime a few years ago, even though they expressed willingness to defect. At the time, they confessed to killing the other crew members on their fishing boat. The Yoon administration emphasizes sending them back was an anti-humanitarian act by the previous government. Kim Bo-kyung has a full story.
After South Korea's Unification Ministry on Tuesday released photos of the 2019 deportation of 2 North Korean fishermen, the incident became even more controversial. In early November 2019, 2 fishermen were captured near the eastern inter-Korean maritime border and later confessed to killing 16 members of their own crew. South Korea sent them back to the north, saying their will to defect was not sincere and that they were felons. Yet the pictures showed how they were unwilling to cross the military demarcation line inside the truce village of Panmunjom while being handed over to North Korean authorities, fearful of what might happen to them. Regarding the photos, the presidential office on Wednesday slammed the previous administration's move to deport them, saying it is an anti-humanitarian crime.
If they were forcibly sent to the north, even though they showed their intention to defect, this would be an anti-humanitarian crime and a crime against humanity that violates both international law and the Constitution. The Yoon Suk-yeol government will fully determine the truth to restore the universal values of freedom and human rights.
Meanwhile, lawmakers from the main opposition Democratic Party of Korea argued that the joint governmental investigation could not find sincerity in the fishermen's intention to defect, as there was no consistency between their words and actions. They also added it was for the safety of the public, given that they were felons.
At the time, the Moon Jae-in administration considered people's safety as the utmost priority, and to prevent our people being exposed to a possible threat, it decided to deport them.
With the presidential office officially calling the decision anti-humanitarian and the Democratic Party refuting such claims, the controversy over the issue is now more aggravated than ever. Some experts say now eyes will be on whether a legitimate process was taken after the fishermen had shown their will to defect. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. US President Joe Biden is on his first Middle East tour since entering the White House. His tour began Wednesday in Israel, where he began meeting with leaders, including Prime Minister Yair Lapid and former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He is set to make an unprecedented flight from Israel to Saudi Arabia, a route that's never been taken before by an American president, which really does signify how the US president is aiming for a normalization of Israeli-Saudi ties amid Washington's tensions with Iran. Along with stabilizing relations between US partners in the region, Biden is also looking to ease oil prices. He'll be meeting with Arab leaders while attending a summit of Gulf countries during his visit to Saudi Arabia. But as the US leader embarks upon this trip, questions remain over Washington's influence in the region. We discussed today what to expect with William F. Wexler, Senior Director of the Rafik Hariri Center and Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council, and Pagyondo, Professor of Euromena Institute of Sogang University here in Seoul. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having us.
And Dr. Wexler, my first question to you. Now, Mr. Biden's trip to the Middle East, it comes 18 months into his presidency, and that's after he toured Europe and Asia. And amid the geopolitical and economic complexities that the world is facing, where would you put the Middle East on President Joe Biden's list of foreign policy priorities right now? I mean, what does he really need to get out of this meeting? Out of these series of meetings, rather?
Sure. I think President Biden and his team have been pretty disciplined and consistent. They've talked about how Russia presents the most important immediate threat to global security, and that China's actions are presenting potentially the greatest strategic threat to global security. The Middle East is important, but is been secondary to great power competition. Amongst the reasons why the trip is happening now, however, is because the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that have resulted from that have taken a significant amount of oil off of the global markets, which has reinforced the understanding in Washington of the importance of the relationships with Saudi Arabia in particular and the wider Gulf region in general. President Biden had planned this trip to Israel before. Now it's finally happening, and it's a good time to also have a trip to Saudi Arabia.
Now, Professor Park, it's believed that President Biden won't be focusing so much on Israeli-Palestinian relations and will want to strengthen the Israeli-Arab network, notably between Tel Aviv and Riyadh. So how do you see the regional dynamics of this really playing out?
I think it takes more time to formalize the diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, because from the political point of view, it is quite right for Saudi Arabia to mend the fences with Israel, but the public opinion is not very favorite about Israel. And at the same time, as the Arabs are still wanting a lot of measures taken by Israel, particularly on the sufferings of the Palestinians, and it is quite difficult for normal Saudi Arabian citizens to accept the government, the diplomatic relations setting up with Israel. So but in the broader picture, the cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel is really needed because United States is rebalancing from Middle East to the Asia Pacific. So probably the President Biden will make a great effort, but I don't think at this time the diplomatic relation or normalization of the relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel would be a little bit difficult, and it takes more time than we expect.
And Dr. X, how awkward is it going to be between President Biden and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman when they meet in Saudi Arabia? I mean, there's been criticism towards the US president for meeting with the controversial Saudi leader amid human rights concerns. How do you think the US leader should really handle this meeting?
Well, the U.S.-Saudi relationship was going to be reset. There are too many interests at stake to have the relationship broken forever. The only question was when and in what context the relationship was going to begin anew. And of course, since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, there have been great concerns inside the United States about the nature of the relationship, and particularly with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. However, those concerns are very well understood by the administration, by the president. I think that it's been widely reported that it was a long process for the President of the United States to come to the conclusion that it was in the best interest of the United States for him to go to Saudi Arabia. But having made that decision that he's going to go, when they do meet, I don't expect any awkwardness. I expect professionals to be talking with each other. I expect a discussion about interests. And I suspect the kind of person-to-person relationship that's going to be absolutely critical in order for the relationship between the two countries to be able to serve U.S. interests.
And Dr. Wexler, before President Biden embarked upon this trip, there was a lot of talk about how the US is really going to recalibrate its relations with Middle Eastern countries. And while Jordan's King Abdullah II, he said he would support the formation of a Middle East military alliance, quite similar to NATO. And there's been a lot of talk about a possible Middle Eastern NATO recently. So what is currently being discussed, and how likely do you think this formation is?
Well, the most important negative factor that's happening in the Middle East writ large is the widespread perception of American withdrawal. That didn't start with the Biden administration. In fact, that's 3 or 4 administrations long, ever since our mistaken invasion of Iraq in 2003. So President Biden is looking to reverse that trend. Now, what is on the table is a deepening of cooperation, especially on maritime and air defense systems, both to keep the United States in and to take advantage of the new opportunities that have emerged from a relationship with Israel and the Gulf countries. That's what's on the table. That's what's being discussed. I wouldn't expect any breakthrough announcements. But as far as an overall NATO type agreement, where there's the equivalent of an Article 5 legal responsibility to come to the aid, I don't expect that to be on the table. I don't think anyone is really looking for that. But what the Gulf countries and the countries in the Middle East are really looking for are some kind of tangible sign that America is not leaving and America is still committed to their security and the wider security of the region.
And of course, Professor Park, other US allies around the world are watching very closely and looking to see what the change of regional relations and dynamics in the Middle East really mean for America's East Asian allies as well, like South Korea, who have ties to the Middle East too, of course. And well, do you think that the recent change of dynamics is going to offer more stability, or are you expecting more regional tension?
Well, actually, from my own experiences, especially talking to my colleagues in the Middle East and visiting to the places in the last 6 months, I found out very interesting the change. Well, the the region is entirely changing right now, and they are talking about the gone are the days with the U.S. working as the unipolar world, and they are not talking about the multipolar. They are talking about the interconnected world. They are actually right now prepared to closely cooperate with any country, like be it Russia or be China. So the United States should make a great effort to mend fences with the traditional regional allies, especially Arab countries. Otherwise, actually, it will be a very difficult situation play for Korea, because the stability and the security are the two most important keywords, not only for the world, but also for the Korea, because 60% of our energy resources coming from that region through the Strait of Hormuz. If anything happens over there, just one night, and the Korea economy will be broken entirely. And also the world economy also will be broken entirely. So we need a great stability in the region, and United States should not make any impression that it is leaving the region, and make a great promise to its traditional allies that United States is taking care of the region without leaving or without without any problem.
And Dr. Wexler, now another huge part of why President Biden is making this trip is to stabilise energy supplies and energy prices, which are surging all around the world. Do you expect to see any developments on that front?
Over time, they won't see an immediate response of the kind that will result in prices plummeting at the gas pump in America. But Saudi Arabia is still the swing producer of oil in the world. If you look at where excess capacity does exist in the world, you're looking really at Saudi Arabia and the UAE today. So on the margins, there are some actions that could be taken. And this is definitely one of the key reasons why the United States has deep interest in the region, and the professor was exactly right, why the United States cannot afford to be seen as withdrawing from the region.
Professor Park, now, do you expect to see a breakthrough happening anytime soon in efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, the Iranian problem is really serious for Korea, especially because we have to give back the $7 billion to Iran, and it is a really, really difficult situation. Actually, it is making a really difficult situation for Korea. And the relationship between Korea and Iran is worse than ever. It's really worst. So we always pray that United States will make a great stride in the reviving the Iranian nuclear deal. But I think probably the President Biden will make a great effort. But I think it is a little bit difficult for United States to revive the deal before the election. But possibly after the election, and the revival would be possible. And probably this time, the President Biden will try to allay anxieties from both the Israeli side and also the Arab side that the revival of the nuclear deal with Iran is much better than without deal. So I hope this time there will be a great progress for the revival of the JCPOA.
Of course, but indirect talks last month, they failed to go through, they failed to produce any outcomes. And Dr. Wexler, do you see any chances of a Iran nuclear deal being revived anytime soon, especially as Iran really reacts to Mr. Biden's trip in the Middle East, where he's trying to bring Israel and Saudi Arabia together?
Anytime soon, no, quite frankly. And the reason why is because Iran doesn't have an interest in doing the deal. And they made that clear in any number of ways. And from the first instance, there are no direct talks at Iran's insistence. They're only doing indirect talks. And they have insisted upon a non-nuclear issue about the designations and sanctions that the United States has on the IRGC for terrorism, for their acts of terrorism, in order for the deal to go forward, which is great irony, because when the deal was originally negotiated, Iran was insistent that nothing other than the nuclear issues be on the table. And now they want something outside the parameters of the nuclear deal on the table. And President Biden just said today that he will not remove the IRGC from the American list of terrorist organizations. So the deal is available for Iran, but I don't see Iran taking it. What the rest of the region is very concerned with is Iranian malign behavior of given precision weaponry and having their proxies use it across borders, and that has not stopped, unfortunately. And I believe that is going to be the discussion that President Biden is going to have both in Israel and in Saudi Arabia.
Well, that was William Wexler, Senior Director of the Rafik Hariri Center and Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council, and Park Yeon-do, Professor at the Euromina Institute of Seogang University. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now turning to COVID, local health authorities are rolling out second booster shots for people as young as 18 if they have underlying health conditions. As the nation's daily virus tally rises, it's decided the rule requiring infected people to stay at home for a week will remain for now. Song Yoo-jin brings us the details.
Starting next Monday, more people in South Korea will be able to roll up their sleeves for a second COVID-19 booster shot. Currently, the shot is only advised for people aged 60 and above, as well as the immunocompromised. But things are about to change as the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters laid out fresh virus prevention measures Wednesday to prepare the country against a possible resurgence of COVID-19 in the coming months.
The effects of the vaccine are waning over time, and the highly transmissible BA.5 Omicron subvariant is becoming the dominant strain. The second booster is to prevent COVID-19-related death and symptoms from turning severe. Because people in their 50s and those with underlying health conditions are especially vulnerable to these risks, we decided to roll out second boosters for them.
The government will also work to increase vaccination rates at facilities for the disabled and the homeless. In terms of treatment, health officials will secure over 1,000 additional sick beds for critically ill patients. And for those who are receiving treatment at home, they will increase the number of the so-called one-stop COVID-19 treatment centers to 10,000 by the end of this month. These centers provide COVID-19 testing, treatment, and prescriptions all in the same place. Currently, there are about 6,300 of them. At the same time, testing and monitoring of those coming into the country will be strengthened. This is due to more people arriving following the lifting of travel restrictions. A PCR test was required within 3 days after arrival before, but after the changes, this will be required on the first day. They are also advised to stay home until the result comes out. But some rules will remain as they are for the time being.
Although stricter social distancing measures such as number caps and private gatherings will not be imposed, mandatory 7-day quarantine and the indoor mask mandate will stay.
This comes as South Korea saw 40,266 new infections as of Tuesday midnight. That's more than double the figure reported at the same time last week, and is the first time in more than 2 months that the tally has topped 40,000. There were 12 related deaths and 67 patients reported as being critically ill. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
The Jeju Forum is being held for the first time since the pandemic. Government officials, business leaders and scholars gather to thrash out the latest economic challenges in Korea and beyond. Arirang brings us the highlights from the 45th edition of this meeting.
On Wednesday, over 600 government officials, business leaders and scholars descended on Korea's southern Jeju Island for the 45th Jeju Forum. Because of the pandemic, it's being held for the first time in 3 years. The theme of this year's forum is Insight and Healing from Jeju Island. At the opening ceremony, the chairman of the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Choi Tae-won, who is also the billionaire chairman of SK Group, urged business leaders to think flexibly.
This year's Jeju Forum aims to provide participants an opportunity for a eureka moment that'll give rise to new thinking and flexibility.
As the first speaker, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho elaborated on the Yoon administration's measures to ramp up economic growth amid global supply chain issues and high inflation.
The government should interfere less with the market and instead encourage companies to work hard, let them pay taxes, and increase the employment rate. So the administration aims to boost private-led growth. The economic crisis is likely to last for a long time, but I promise that the government will help companies get through it.
Insightful advice on geopolitical and economic risks was given by overseas experts too. Adam Tooze, a professor at Columbia University, said post-war liberal order is being challenged by global economic risks, China's dramatic growth, and the climate crisis. He also said it's important to build cooperation between Korea and the EU in a new paradigm where the US and China are competing to dominate the global supply chain. After 3 years of the pandemic, KCCI wants to prepare a red carpet for this year's forum participants. The 3-day event will run through Friday, providing lectures and activities on a wide range of topics, including global economic uncertainties, the new government's financial policies, and the future of digital human technology. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News, Jeju.
Earlier this month, Jun He became the first person of Korean descent to win the Fields Medal, the world's highest honor for young mathematicians. The Princeton professor gave a speech at the Korea Institute for Advanced Study in Seoul. Ishiu tells us more.
Jun He, a Princeton University professor of Korean descent, was awarded the prestigious Fields Medal earlier this month. Awarded every 4 years by the International Mathematical Union, it's given to high-achieving mathematicians under the age of 40. And on Wednesday, the 39-year-old mathematician met with reporters at the Korea Institute for Advanced Study in Seoul. At the press conference, He explained why the speech he was going to give was called Boundaries and Relationship.
I pondered what topic non-mathematicians would understand and find meaningful. So I chose to speak about emotions I have as a mathematician about the two words.
And for students and how they can persevere and find their passion, He said the key is self-encouragement.
When things aren't working out too well, I hope you can keep a pure heart, have patience, and give yourself time. If you give yourself some subtle encouragement, I think you'll get good results.
In his lecture, He elaborated on his thoughts as a mathematician using friendly metaphors, comparing mathematics to a game he played as a child, tracing words through the dictionary. He also compared it to a picture of deep space.
This picture shows the sheer scale of our universe. Each and every shining dot is a galaxy. There seems to be some kind of geometric structure here. Each of these shining things here could be a conjecture.
After, Professor Kim Young-hoon of Seoul National University, who was previously He's teacher there, explained the significance of his academic contributions. He was awarded the Fields Medal for his profound insights connecting two areas of mathematics, combinatorics and geometry. Combinatorics is an area of mathematics primarily concerned with counting, while geometry studies the properties of shapes and spaces. He solved central problems that had remained open for decades called Reed's conjecture and developed a theory of great importance for both fields. According to the International Mathematical Union, He was recognized for bringing the ideas of Hodge's theory to combinatorics, also for proving the Heron-Rota-Welsh conjecture for matroids, proving the Strong-Mason conjecture, developing the theory of Lorentzian polynomials, and more. His findings have real-life applications in fields such as IT, semiconductor design, transportation, and machine learning. Ho will go on a family trip next week before beginning his summer research at Korea Institute for Advanced Study. 이시후, 아리랑 뉴스.
For a look at the news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley standing by at the Arirang newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning to you guys.
Hi Matt, let's start by heading to Sri Lanka, which has erupted into fresh protests after the president fled the country.
Well, that's right, Soo-young. New protests were triggered by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fleeing to the neighboring Maldives and appointing his Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe as acting president. Now, the protests come as the president still has not stepped down after promising to do so by Wednesday. His acting president has imposed a military curfew until 5 a.m. on Thursday. Protesters have broken into the Prime Minister's office for the second time in a week, and other demonstrations have erupted outside Parliament. According to hospital reports, at least 75 people have been injured across the two protests. This follows weeks of unrest as many blame the Rajapaksa administration for Sri Lanka's economic crisis. Now, 4 former executives have been ordered to pay billions of dollars in compensation to shareholders over the 2011 Fukushima nuclear power plant meltdown. A Tokyo court on Wednesday ordered the executives of Tokyo Electric Power Company to pay around $95 billion in damages. The district court found that TEPCO's countermeasures against tsunami dangers lacked safety and responsibility. The legal proceedings were started in 2012 by shareholders who said they suffered heavy losses from decommissioning the plant and compensating nearby residents following the meltdown caused when a tsunami hit the nuclear plant. Now, Hungary has declared a state of emergency over worries that it could run out of oil and gas. Government officials said on Wednesday that Europe might not have sufficient gas for heating during the autumn and winter, due to the prolonged war in Ukraine and subsequent sanctions on Russia. Now, Hungary is heavily reliant on Russian gas, which makes up around 65% of its oil and 85% of its gas supplies. The Central European country will now instead increase domestic energy supplies to meet demand, stepping up its coal mining and natural gas production. It will also extend the operating time of its nuclear power plant and ban energy exports. Lifting off from a European spaceport based in French New Guinea, the European Space Agency successfully launched its new medium-lift Vega-C rocket. The 4-stage medium-sized space rocket took flight on Wednesday in a debut mission to send 7 satellites into low orbit. Vega-C looks set to fill the gap left by a lack of Russian rockets no longer available due to the war in Ukraine. The rocket is capable of carrying up to 2.4 metric tons of payload to an orbit roughly 700 kilometers above Earth. Among the satellites launched is the 295-kilogram Laser Relativity Satellite 2, tasked with testing Einstein's general theory of relativity, as well as 6 CUBE satellites which will be used for a number of monitoring purposes, including forestry, disaster management, and climate change.
Good morning. Well, it was pouring down all day in the capital yesterday, and the Seoul metropolitan area saw more than 100 millimeters of torrential rain in a single day, causing severe evening chaos. Well, right now it's raining mostly in south coast regions, and the coastline of Jeollanam-do province is forecast to see more than 80 millimeters of rainfall, with a heavy rain advisory being in place. And this band of monsoon rain will let up in the morning hours, while Jeju Island will see on and off rain through tomorrow night. Well, we had comfortable overnight temperatures in the capital despite that high humidity, but Jeju Island had a sweltering night. Morning temperatures are already close to 30 degrees Celsius there. And as soon as the monsoonal front takes a break, blistering heat will set in.
Afternoon temperatures will be 5 to 7 degrees higher compared to yesterday, so Seoul will be going up to 32 degrees, Daegu topping out at 34 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Well, there will be a chance of passing rain across Korea for the rest of the week, while summer warms should continue. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that wraps up our newscast for this hour, but we'll be back tomorrow for our Friday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning, but do stick around for more updates throughout the day. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are, and as always, take care.